Most people think a plane is just a car with wings, but in my world, a missing decimal point does not just mean a breakdown on the shoulder of the highway, it means a fireball that can be seen from 3 counties away. I spent 15 years becoming a master of vintage aviation restoration, only to have a failed luxury car salesman destroy a $30 million project and my reputation in a single summer. So I decided to let the laws of physics and federal law do the talking for me. My name is Julian, and I am the lead restoration engineer for a high-end vintage aircraft hangar. We do not just fix planes, we resurrect history. We take piles of rusted aluminum and rotted rubber from the jungles of the Pacific or the fields of France and turn them back into the screaming silver monsters that won World War II. It is a world of obsessive detail where every single rivet must be checked, every wire must be aviation grade, and every signature in a logbook is a legal oath that a pilot's life is safe in your hands. The crown jewel of our shop was a P-51 Mustang nicknamed the Silver Ghost. It was a rare, D-model scout variant, and it was being restored for a billionaire tech mogul who had more money than patience. This project was my life for 2 years. I had a team of 3 other specialists, including my right-hand man, Silas. Silas was a 70-year-old mechanic who could tell you if an engine was running rich just by the vibration in the floor joists. We were a brotherhood of grease and precision until Arthur, the owner of the hangar, decided that blood was thicker than professional standards. Arthur was a good man, but he was getting old and wanted to retire. He had no children of his own, so he brought in his nephew, Vance, to be our new senior project manager. Vance was the kind of man who wore a $3,000 suit to a hangar where we were actively stripping lead paint and spraying corrosive cleaners. He had spent the last 5 years getting fired from high-end car dealerships because he kept getting caught skimming off the top of customer trade-ins. He knew absolutely nothing about aviation. On his first day, he walked into the clean room where we were overhauling the Merlin engine and tapped on the cylinder head with a heavy gold ring, leaving a visible scratch on the polished surface. He looked at me and Silas and told us that our workflow was prehistoric. He said that the reason the restoration was taking so long was because we were too focused on the things that nobody would ever see. In the world of aviation restoration, the things nobody sees are the only things that matter. I tried to explain to Vance that we were currently working on the internal wing spars. These are the structural bones that keep the wings from snapping off when the plane pulls 5 Gs in a turn. They were showing signs of intergranular corrosion, which meant they needed to be stripped, treated with a specific chemical called allodyne, and then coated in a high-grade zinc chromate primer. It is a tedious, toxic, and expensive process that takes weeks of curing time. Vance just rolled his eyes and checked his watch. He told me that he had promised the client a flight-ready unveiling in 3 months to coincide with the annual Coastal Aviation Gala. I told him that was impossible. The engine alone needed another 200 hours of bench testing. Vance did not like the word impossible. He started showing up at the hangar at 6 in the morning and staying until midnight, not to help, but to micromanage. He began a campaign of subtle sabotage and professional gaslighting. He would move my calibrated tools so I would lose an hour searching for them. He would accidentally delete digital work orders from the server. But the worst part was the way he treated the expertise of the crew. He called Silas a legacy cost and told him to his face that a kid with a YouTube tutorial could do his job faster. Vance's goal was simple. He wanted to cut the restoration time in half so he could trigger a massive efficiency bonus in the contract that Arthur had foolishly signed. The turning point came during the 3rd month of Vance's reign of terror. I caught him in the parts cage, replacing a box of certified AN-grade bolts with a crate of industrial hardware he had bought from a local construction supplier. For those who do not know, aviation bolts are tested for specific shear strengths and have unique head markings. If you use a standard hardware store bolt in a high-stress aircraft component, the vibrations will snap it like a toothpick. When I confronted him, Vance did not even blink. He told me that a bolt is a bolt, and that I was just trying to run up the bill to justify my own salary. He then informed me that since I was being so difficult, he was taking over the logbook entries. In the eyes of the Federal Aviation Administration, the person who signs the logbook is the person responsible for the plane. He was literally stealing my authority and my legal protection. I went to Arthur to complain, but the nepotism was a stone wall. Arthur told me that Vance was family and that I needed to learn to work with his modern business approach. He told me that if I could not get along with the new management, he would find a lead engineer who could. I looked at the Silver Ghost, the plane I had poured my soul into, and I realized that Vance was not just going to ruin the plane, he was going to kill whoever eventually sat in that cockpit. That was the moment I realized that being the good guy and following the rules was not going to work. Vance wanted a fast, cheap, and shiny plane for the gala, and he was willing to commit fraud to get it. I decided that if he wanted to sign his name to a disaster, I was going to make sure that disaster was so spectacular that no amount of family loyalty could save him. I signaled to Silas that we were going to stop fighting Vance. We were going to do exactly what he asked, and we were going to document every single second of it. The atmosphere in the hangar shifted from a temple of craftsmanship to a high-pressure sweatshop within a matter of weeks. Vance was no longer just an annoyance. He had become a genuine hazard to the integrity of the aircraft and the sanity of the crew. I tried to maintain a professional distance, focusing on the work and hoping that the sheer weight of FAA regulations would eventually force him to back off. I was wrong. Vance viewed regulations as suggestions and my expertise as a barrier to his promotion. The first major incident happened during the structural rebuild of the tail section. Silas and I had spent 3 days performing a dye-penetrant inspection on the vertical stabilizer's main attachment points. We found what we feared, a hairline stress fracture in the forged aluminum housing. In the aviation world, this is a stop-work event. You do not patch a forged housing, you replace it, or you send it to a specialized facility for X-ray guided laser welding and retempering. I marked the part with red torque seal and entered the defect into the digital maintenance log. 2 hours later, Vance stormed into the hangar clutching a tablet. He didn't ask about the safety implications. He wanted to know why the labor hours for the tail assembly had spiked. I showed him the fracture, explaining that the metal was fatigued and that if it snapped in flight, the pilot would lose all directional control. Vance didn't even look at the part. He told me that I was over-engineering the problem to pad my hours. He claimed he had consulted a friend who worked at a body shop, and they told him a simple TIG weld and some filler would make it look brand new. I tried to explain the difference between a fender on a Honda and a structural component of a fighter plane pulling 400 miles per hour, but he held up a hand to silence me. He told me he had already hired an outside contractor, a guy who did custom exhaust pipes for street racers, to come in that evening and fix the crack. I went to Arthur immediately, my heart pounding. I told him that if that part wasn't replaced properly, the plane was a flying coffin. Arthur looked at me with tired eyes and said that Vance was just trying to keep the billionaire client happy. He told me to let the contractor do his work and that Vance would take full responsibility for the sign-off. I realized then that Arthur wasn't just blinded by family. He was being manipulated into thinking I was the problem. The contractor came in, slapped a messy weld over the fracture, and Vance personally spray-painted it with silver lacquer to hide the evidence. It looked perfect on the outside, but inside, the metal was now brittle and ready to shatter. The second incident was more personal and designed to break my spirit. Every lead engineer in this industry keeps a shop Bible. It is a personal, handwritten logbook where we document every unique challenge, every specific torque setting, and every custom shim measurement for the planes we restore. Mine was 15 years old, filled with diagrams and notes that were irreplaceable. It was my professional legacy. Vance decided that proprietary company information should not be kept in personal notebooks. During a Monday morning briefing in front of the entire crew, Vance walked over to my workbench and picked up my Bible. He told the team that from now on, all notes had to be entered into a centralized software he had purchased, which was basically a glorified inventory tracker that was completely useless for engineering. When I reached for my book, he stepped back and told me it was now company property. He then laughed and pointed out a hand-drawn diagram I had made of the Merlin engine's oil cooling system, calling it cute and saying it looked like a child's drawing. He threw the book into a cardboard box and told me I could have it back once he had vetted it for trade secrets. Silas almost threw a wrench at him, and I had to physically hold the old man back. I spent that evening in the office, calmly asking Vance for the book back, explaining its sentimental and technical value. He told me that if I asked again, he would have me escorted off the premises for insubordination. He wasn't just stealing my work, he was trying to erase my identity as a professional. The final straw came when we moved to the integral fuel tanks. The P-51 has tanks built directly into the wing structure, sealed with a specific high-cost aviation compound called ProSeal. It is expensive, it smells like rotting eggs, and it takes a very specific mixing ratio to cure properly. Vance saw the invoice for the next batch of ProSeal and nearly had a stroke. He canceled the order, and 2 days later, a pallet of industrial-grade roofing sealant arrived from a home improvement warehouse. I met him at the loading dock, trying to remain calm. I told him that aviation fuel is highly corrosive to standard rubber and that this roofing sealant would dissolve within hours of being submerged in 100 LL fuel. I even brought him the material safety data sheets for both products, showing him the chemical incompatibility. Vance looked at the sheets, crumpled them into a ball, and tossed them into the trash. He told me that he was the project manager and that his job was to manage the project's bottom line, while my job was to shut up and smear the goo. When I refused to apply the wrong sealant, he threatened to fire Silas. Silas was 6 months away from his pension, and Arthur had given Vance the power to make personnel adjustments. Silas looked at me, his eyes wet with rage, and I knew I couldn't let him lose his retirement because of this monster. I looked Vance dead in the eye and said, "Fine, we will do it your way." Vance smirked, patted me on the shoulder like I was a disobedient dog, and walked away. That was the night the plan changed. I went to Silas and told him we were no longer engineers. We were actors. We were going to follow every single one of Vance's cost-saving orders to the absolute letter, but we weren't going to do it blindly. I went out and bought a hidden body camera and a high-capacity digital recorder. From that moment on, every time Vance gave an order that violated a safety protocol, I asked him to clarify it in front of the camera. Every time he told us to skip a structural step, I made him sign a physical workaround sheet that I told him was for internal tracking. He was so arrogant and so desperate for a paper trail that proved he was innovating that he signed everything. He thought he was building a case for his own brilliance. In reality, he was signing his own professional death warrant, and I was just waiting for the gala to provide the audience. The week before the Coastal Aviation Gala was supposed to be the proudest moment of my career, but it became the day I watched my history dissolve in a vat of industrial solvent. Vance had become increasingly paranoid as the deadline approached. He knew the Silver Ghost was held together by hope and the wrong hardware, and he needed a scapegoat in case anything went wrong. He also knew that my silence was not a sign of submission, but a sign of observation. He decided that he could not just fire me, he had to erase any evidence that I was ever the lead engineer on the project. I arrived at the hangar on Tuesday morning to find the crew standing in a circle near the engine test stand. In the center was an industrial degreaser tank, a deep steel vat filled with a high-strength solvent designed to strip carbonized oil from steel components. Vance was standing over it, holding my shop Bible. He was smiling, a jagged, ugly expression of pure power. He had gone into my locked drawer and taken it. I saw the look on Silas's face. It was a look of pure, helpless grief. Silas knew what that book meant. It contained the hand-drawn schematics my father had made when he taught me how to rivet aluminum on an old Cessna when I was 10 years old. It contained 15 years of my life. Vance looked at me and said that he had finished his review of my so-called technical notes. He told me that since I was so fond of the old ways of doing things, I should enjoy seeing them return to the elements. Before I could move, before I could even draw a breath to scream, he dropped the leather-bound book into the degreaser. The solvent was so strong that the ink began to bleed and the paper began to curl and disintegrate within seconds. The drawings of my father, the notes on the Merlin engine, the history of my hands, it all turned into a black, oily sludge at the bottom of a tank. Vance then reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. He handed one to me. It was a formal termination notice for gross insubordination and attempted sabotage. But he didn't stop there. He pulled up his laptop on a nearby workbench and showed me a blind copy email he had sent to the National Vintage Aircraft Association and the top 5 restoration museums in the country. In the email, he claimed that I had been caught intentionally installing substandard parts to spite the company and that I was mentally unstable. He was blackballing me from the only industry I had ever known. He was making sure that even if I left, I would never be able to touch an airplane again. I stood there for a long time, staring at the oily ripples in the degreaser tank. Silas was shaking, his fists clenched, waiting for me to explode. He expected me to tackle Vance, to swing a wrench, to do something that would justify the police being called. But something strange happened inside my mind. The rage, which had been a hot, flickering flame for months, suddenly turned into a block of absolute zero ice. The sadness left me. The sense of loss for my father's notes evaporated. In its place was a crystalline, mechanical clarity. I realized that I had been trying to save the plane and the company because I loved the craft, but the craft didn't exist here anymore. Only the physics remained. I looked up at Vance. I didn't yell, I didn't even frown. I actually let out a small, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. I told him that I understood. I told him that if I was leaving, I at least wanted the satisfaction of knowing the engine would start for the gala. I told him that Silas and I would stay for the next 48 hours as unpaid contractors just to finish the final timing on the Merlin engine. I told him that the engine didn't roar for the billionaire client, his efficiency bonus would be 0, and Arthur would lose the hangar. Vance was a greedy man, and greedy men are easy to bait. He saw the logic. He thought he had broken me so completely that I was now desperate to please him just to keep a shred of my reputation. He agreed. He told Silas and me we could stay until the gala, provided we didn't touch the logbooks and stayed away from the wing assemblies. He thought he was being clever, keeping the experts around to ensure the shiny part worked while he took all the credit. What Vance didn't understand was that he had given me exactly what I needed: time and access. I walked over to Silas and whispered one thing to him. I told him to go to the chemical locker and find the bottles of concentrated gallium I had ordered for a metallurgical experiment months ago. Gallium is a soft metal that is harmless to humans, but it is a literal virus for aluminum. If you apply a tiny amount of liquid gallium to a structural aluminum component, it undergoes a process called liquid metal embrittlement. It doesn't melt the metal, it infiltrates the molecular lattice and turns the solid aluminum into something with the structural integrity of a wet cracker. I spent the next 2 days in a state of cold, calculated precision. While Vance was busy on the phone with the gala planners, Silas and I were tuning the engine. But we were also doing something else. We knew the Silver Ghost would be parked on the tarmac for the unveiling, under the hot sun. We knew the billionaire client would want to sit in the cockpit and cycle the landing gear and the flaps. We applied the gallium to the very specific, non-certified bolts Vance had forced us to use in the landing gear struts and the flap actuators. Because the bolts were the wrong alloy, the reaction would be accelerated by the heat of the sun and the hydraulic pressure of the system. I wasn't going to let the plane fly and kill someone. I knew that the failure would happen the moment the pilot tried to taxi the aircraft for the crowd. The wings wouldn't fall off in the air. The gear would simply fold like a house of cards the moment the weight shifted, dropping $30 million of history onto the pavement in front of the FAA, the billionaire, and every camera in the state. And because Vance had insisted on signing the logbooks and the workaround sheets, the paper trail of every single substandard part in skipped safety check would lead directly to his desk. I watched Vance walk around the hangar that final evening, snapping photos of his masterpiece for social media. He looked at me and told me I should be grateful he was letting me witness his success. I just nodded and told him that tomorrow would be a day that no one in the aviation world would ever forget. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of a collapse that had been fueled by his own greed, and I was going to enjoy the silence that followed the crash. The final 48 hours were a masterclass in silent execution. Vance believed he had won, and in his arrogance he allowed the two people he had most insulted to be the primary handlers of his prize. While Vance spent his time in the air-conditioned front office, rehearsing his speech and picking out which tie would look best on camera, Silas and I were in the trenches of the Silver Ghost. The hangar was quiet, the air thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and the metallic tang of the degreaser that had claimed my life's work. Silas worked with a grim, focused intensity that required no words. He knew exactly what we were doing, and he knew that for the first time in his 50-year career, he was intentionally building a failure. The core of the trap was built on a foundation of malicious compliance and the terrifying properties of liquid metal. Gallium is an element that sits just above room temperature as a solid, but once it melts, it becomes a molecular ghost. When applied to aluminum, it doesn't just sit on the surface like rust, it travels through the grain boundaries of the metal. It turns a structural alloy into something with the strength of wet cardboard. I had 4 small vials of it, and I knew exactly where to put them. I didn't touch the main wing spars of the engine mounts because I am not a murderer. If those failed during a flight, the pilot would die. Instead, I focused on the components that are only stressed during the transition from the ground to the air. I applied the gallium to the landing gear trunnions, the heavy pivot points that hold the weight of the aircraft when it is on the ground. I also applied it to the flap actuator rods. Because Vance had forced us to use non-aviation grade bolts and it skipped the anti-corrosion allodyne treatment to save time, the aluminum was naked, and the cheap steel bolts created a galvanic reaction that pulled the gallium into the structure even faster. In the cool of the night, the gallium remained relatively stable, but I knew that the gala would take place on the asphalt tarmac in the direct afternoon sun. The heat would melt the gallium, the chemical reaction would peak, and the structural integrity of the gear would vanish exactly when the billionaire client climbed into the cockpit to show off for the press. But a physical crash was only half of the plan. A mechanical failure could be blamed on bad luck or material fatigue. I needed the blame to be legally, undeniably tethered to Vance's neck. This is where the industry's own bureaucracy became my greatest weapon. In aviation, there is a document called FAA Form 337. It is the form used to record major repairs and alterations. Usually, as the lead engineer, I would fill these out and sign them, certifying that every part used was airworthy. Since Vance had stripped me of my authority and was signing the logbooks himself, he was now the person in responsible charge. I spent the second night helping Vance by organizing the digital filing system he had forced us to use. He was too lazy to actually read the technical specifications, so when I told him I was pre-filling the Form 337s to save him time during the gala, he practically kissed my feet. I filled out dozens of forms. In the description of work section, I wrote the absolute terrifying truth in dense, technical jargon that I knew Vance wouldn't understand. I listed the exact grade of the hardware store bolts, I documented the use of roofing sealant in the fuel tanks, I noted the uncertified weld on the cracked tail housing. I then used the company's digital signature system, which Vance had proudly set up to be paperless, to have him sign off on the draft work packages. Because he was in a rush to get home and change for the pre-gala dinner, he didn't even look at the screens. He just clicked accept and sign over and over again. He was digitally certifying, under penalty of federal perjury, that he had knowingly authorized the use of non-aviation parts in a $30 million restoration. I then set these files to auto-upload to the FAA's digital portal the moment the gala's opening ceremony began. The final piece of the domino line was the audience. I knew that Arthur had invited the regional director of the FAA to the gala to show off how efficiently the hangar was running under new management. I also knew that the billionaire client, a man named Marcus, was notoriously litigious. He didn't just sue people, he erased them. I sent an anonymous tip to the regional director's office using a burner phone. I didn't tell them the plane was a hazard. I told them that the Silver Ghost was a marvel of modern cost-cutting innovation and that they should pay special attention to the landing gear assemblies as they represented a new standard in civilian restoration. I knew that an FAA inspector's ears would prick up at the words cost-cutting and new standard like a shark smelling blood in the water. By the morning of the gala, the hangar was spotless. The Silver Ghost sat in the center of the floor, its polished aluminum skin gleaming so brightly it hurt to look at it. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece. To me and Silas, it was a hollow shell, a monument to a man's ego that was currently rotting from the inside out. Vance arrived at noon, looking smug in a white linen suit. He didn't even look at me as he ordered the ground crew to tow the plane out onto the tarmac. I stood in the shadows of the hangar doors, watching the sun hit the landing gear. I could almost visualize the gallium molecules dancing, sliding between the aluminum crystals, turning the forged metal into dust. I had my bags packed in my car. I had the backup of every recording, every signed workaround sheet, and every photo of the disintegrated shop Bible stored on an encrypted cloud drive. Silas stood next to me, his hands finally clean of grease. I asked him if he was ready to retire. He looked at the plane, then at Vance, who was currently shaking hands with the billionaire and the FAA director. Silas spit on the floor and said that it was a beautiful day for a crash. We weren't just walking away from a job, we were walking away from a crime scene that we had meticulously prepared for the person who had actually committed the crime. The clock was ticking, the metal was warming, and Vance was about to learn that in aviation, the truth always lands, one way or another. The heat on the tarmac was over 90 degrees by the time the opening ceremony of the Coastal Aviation Gala began. I stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing a clean shirt and a neutral expression, watching Vance perform. He was in his element, standing on a makeshift stage in front of the Silver Ghost, holding a microphone and basking in the flashbulbs of the local press. He spoke about innovation, efficiency, and the new era of aviation management he had brought to his uncle's hangar. Arthur stood beside him, looking proud but tired, oblivious to the fact that his legacy was currently baking in the sun. Marcus, the billionaire client, was a man who expected perfection because he had the resources to demand it. He stood near the front, looking at the P-51 with the hunger of a man who had just bought the fastest toy in the world. When Vance finished his speech, he grandly invited Marcus to climb into the cockpit to perform a systems demonstration for the crowd. This was the moment. I looked at Silas, who was leaning against a support beam near the hangar doors. He gave me a single, slow nod. As Marcus climbed the yellow ladder and slid into the pilot's seat, the sun had been beating down on the landing gear trunnions for 3 hours. The gallium was no longer a solid, it was a liquid virus that had successfully infiltrated the molecular grain of the aluminum. Marcus settled into the seat, and the weight of the aircraft shifted as he began his pre-flight checks. He flipped the master switch, and the restored Merlin engine roared to life with a sound that shook the ground. The crowd cheered. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. Then, Marcus reached for the hydraulic lever to cycle the flaps. As the hydraulic pressure built to 3,000 pounds per square inch, the flap actuator rods, now as structurally sound as wet clay, simply folded. The flaps didn't extend, they twisted and jammed with a sickening metallic groan. Marcus, confused, tried to adjust the throttle, causing the massive airframe to vibrate. That vibration was the final trigger. The right landing gear trunnion, the primary load-bearing point, shattered. It didn't snap, it crumbled into a gray crystalline powder. The crowd gasped as the right wing of the Silver Ghost dipped violently. A split second later, the left side followed suit. The $30 million aircraft didn't just fall, it sagged into the pavement with a sound like a giant stepping on an empty soda can. The propeller, still spinning, struck the asphalt, shearing the blades off and sending them whistling through the air like shrapnel. Silence fell over the tarmac, broken only by the hiss of escaping coolant and the high-pitched whine of a dying hydraulic pump. Marcus climbed out of the cockpit, his face a mask of cold, vibrating fury. He wasn't hurt, but he was insulted. He looked at the mangled remains of his investment. Then he looked at Vance. Vance was frozen. He dropped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the speakers. He started stammering, looking around for me, his eyes wide with a desperate need for a scapegoat. He spotted me near the back of the crowd and pointed a shaking finger. He screamed that I had sabotaged the plane, that I was the disgruntled engineer he had fired for instability. But I didn't have to say a word. The regional director of the FAA, who was standing 5 feet away from the wreckage, was already walking toward the right landing gear strut. He reached down and picked up a piece of the shattered metal. He didn't even need a magnifying glass to see the problem. The cheap steel bolts Vance had forced us to use had snapped clean, and the residue of the roofing sealant was leaking out of the wing roots, smelling like a construction site instead of a hangar. I walked forward, not toward Vance, but toward Marcus and the FAA director. I handed the director a ruggedized tablet. I told him that as the former lead engineer, I had felt a moral obligation to document the innovative techniques Vance had implemented. I showed him the digital folder. It contained the high-resolution video of Vance dropping my father's notes into the degreaser. It contained the audio recordings of Vance ordering us to use hardware store bolts. Most importantly, it contained the FAA Form 337s that Vance had digitally signed 48 hours ago, certifying that he had personally authorized every single one of those violations. The fallout was a surgical strike. The FAA didn't just fine the company, they issued an emergency order suspending the hangar's repair station certificate indefinitely. Because Vance had signed those forms under penalty of perjury, he was facing federal charges for falsifying aviation records, a felony that carries a mandatory prison sentence. Marcus didn't just sue for the cost of the plane. His legal team filed a massive fraud and endangerment lawsuit that targeted Vance personally and Arthur's business assets. Because I had documented Arthur's refusal to listen to my safety warnings, the corporate veil was pierced. Arthur lost the hangar, the equipment, and his retirement fund in the settlement. He wasn't a bad man, but his blind loyalty to a predator had cost him everything he had built. Vance's attempt to blackball me backfired spectacularly. When the news hit the vintage aviation community, the email Vance had sent was used as evidence of his malicious intent. Every museum and restoration shop in the country saw the recordings of him destroying my father's work. I didn't have to look for a job. The phone started ringing within 48 hours. Today, Silas and I run our own small boutique restoration shop 3 states away. We don't have a massive hangar or a billionaire client list yet, but we have something Vance could never understand: A reputation built on the truth. Vance is currently halfway through a 4-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. His family, including Arthur, has completely cut him off to salvage what is left of their own reputations. The last I heard, he was trying to get a job in the prison wood shop, but he was banned because he kept trying to optimize the safety guards on the table saws. I still don't have my father's notebook. That history is gone. But every time I torque a certified AN-grade bolt to its exact specification, I feel like I am honoring him far more than a book ever could. I learned that you can't fight a man like Vance with his own weapons. You just have to wait for the sun to come out and let the weight of his own lies do the crushing for you. In the world of aviation, gravity is the only judge that cannot be bribed.